Atkinson. I'm president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, which is a nonpartisan think tank in D.C. that focuses on technology policy issues. And we're pleased to co-sponsor this event today with the New America Foundation, with my colleague at the far end of the table, Michael Calabrese, who is the real leader on the policy side of this particular issue of white spaces. So what we're going to do is I'm going to introduce our four speakers. I'll make a few opening remarks or framing remarks. We'll hear first from Congressman Inslee, and then we'll go down the table. And we should have a hard stop at 2:30, and we should have plenty of time for all sorts of questions and discussion. So as I said, we'll hear first from Congressman Inslee. Congressman Inslee is a Democratic congressman from the Puget Sound area in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. He's in Washington, D.C. now, but he's in Washington State. He was a representative of the 4th Congressional District in Washington State from 92 to 94, and now represents the 1st Congressional District since 1999. He's on the House Energy and Commerce Committee, where he focuses on a number of issues, including clean energy, but also telecommunications. He was recently appointed to the 15-member Select Committee on Energy Independence and Global Warming, and he is also the author of a legislation on white spaces, which I'm sure he will discuss when he speaks. Before he was elected to Congress, Congressman Inslee was a state legislator and also a prosecutor in Washington State. Second, we'll hear from Peter Tanula. Peter is the Vice President of Regulatory Affairs and Business Development at the Shared Spectrum Company. Peter played a key role in the development, implementation, and marketing of dynamic spectrum access radios and spectrum management systems, so a perfect commentator today on many of these issues. Prior to joining SSC in February 2006, Peter was at the FCC for 15.5 years, where he held several positions, including acting deputy bureau chief of the Wireless Telecom Bureau. He was director of the Spectrum Task Force, senior legal advisor to Chairman Powell, senior counsel to Bill Kennard, and staff attorney at the Mass Media Bureau. I won't read the rest of it, but I encourage you to do so. He has a degree in law degree at the University of Washington University. Third will be Pierre DeVries. Pierre is a research fellow at the Economic Policy Research Center, also in Washington State, University of Washington. I won't describe what he does because it doesn't make any sense to me, but reading that is pretty complicated. I think it has something to do with software programming. But he also does work on communications policy issues, including spectrum allocation. Before he took that position, he was the Chief of Incubation and Senior Director of Advanced Technology and Policy at Microsoft. And prior to Microsoft, he worked at Corda and Company, a London-based seed capital company investing in technology companies. And finally, Michael Calabrese. As I said earlier, Michael's the Vice President and the Director of the Wireless Future Program at New America. He oversees New America's efforts to improve our nation's management of the public airwaves and to promote ubiquitous and affordable wireless broadband access. Prior to that, he was the General Counsel at the JEC here and also Counsel at the AFL-CIO. He's written co-authored 3 books and many, many articles and op-eds that I'm sure you've all seen. He's a graduate of Stanford Business and Law School and has a graduate degree at Harvard. So, with that, let me just sort of try to frame this issue just a bit. I'm sure if you're here, you're familiar with it, but let me just go through it. With the DTV transition that will be occurring in 2009, the broadcasters are going to be returning their current analog channel that they're using, and that's going to be auctioned off, and auction proceedings the FCC is ruling on. In addition, they ruled that the channels from 52 to 69 will be auctioned. The digital channels will be auctioned off as well. But that leaves the channels 2 through 51 to be used for over-the-air digital signal broadcasting for TV. The problem with that, though, is that about half of that spectrum is essentially unused. It's just lying there fallow. And in many markets, rural markets, as little as 20 to 25% of that spectrum. And so there's a real opportunity here to use that spectrum for other uses in a way that doesn't interfere with the TV spectrum. I don't know where you got your invite from. If you got your invite from ITIF, it actually said on there something along the lines of free lunch. There is a free lunch. I think if you got your invite from New America, it didn't say that. we were sort of having a conflict over whether we should say that because we thought you might literally interpret that as there would be a free lunch today. I argued that I didn't think that Hill staffers were that literal. But in any case, there are free cookies back there and free soda if you want that. The illusion of the free lunch was essentially we have all of the spectrum that is a very valuable resource for innovation and new services that really could be used and right now is not being used. And so the FCC is proceeding to decide how to use that spectrum. And there are several bills in Congress, including one that Congressman Inslee has sponsored, that would allow that spectrum to be used in an unlicensed format. Spectrum is actually really sort of difficult to get your hands around, your mind around, I think, for a lot of people, including me, because it's a non-tangible thing. But I think a good analogy to thinking about this would be to think about, let's assume there's a public highway, and it has lots of space on it, but we decide for some reason we're not going to let other cars use that highway, and we're going to force them to go on a little two-lane road with lots of congestion. That would be the analogy here. We have all of the space. It could be used if we wanted to, but we're choosing not to do it. So there are really two main issues here, and I won't go into any details, but the two main issues are, can we use this spectrum without causing interference to existing uses? And the principal existing use, obviously, is television. And that, in many ways, is simply a technical question. And I think the answer to that technical question is yes, we can. That there are new technologies, including smart radios, that enable that spectrum to be used, enable a device to figure out where the spectrum is currently being used and to not use that. Now, that's obviously a big debate, but we'll hear more about that. In particular, Peter will focus on that particular issue and why you actually can use the spectrum without interference. Second question is, and there are actually a lot of people on this side who will admit that we can use the spectrum. The question is, well, how do we then allocate? Who gets to use that spectrum? And there are people who will argue that the best use of that is to auction it off. And there are, frankly, some people who are, I would argue, sort of property rights advocates who will say all spectrum, no matter what use, should be auctioned off. That's the most efficient way to do that. And I guess our view is that we would argue this is not an ideological question. It's really a pragmatic or practical question. And I think in reality, the best system is one that has a mix of both licensed and unlicensed. This is not sort of an open source commons argument that all spectrum should be in the hands of the people. But conversely, it's not an argument that says all spectrum should be licensed. If we have a mix of spectrum that some licensed, some unlicensed, it appears to be the best way to get innovation and investment. Let me just wrap up by saying, we think about this innovation we've already had in unlicensed. I just ran a race, actually Michael, his daughter, ran in the same race on Sunday in our local school. And my legs actually tell me that I ran that race. But one of the things they had is I ran at the back of the thing, and so if they didn't have this little wireless chip in my shoe, my actual time would have been much worse than my clock time, which I was relying on so that I didn't do awfully. But the point is that if we didn't have unlicensed spectrum, that little interesting device that's a shoe, a little radio device in your shoe that lets you run races now, we wouldn't have that. We wouldn't have all sorts of things that we now take for granted, like wireless cameras or wireless telemetry for reading. There are wineries now in California that have wireless devices that read the condition of the grapes in terms of temperature and moisture. Baby monitors, all of those that we know about, cordless telephones, garage door openers, wireless meter readers. There's an amazing amount, an array of these things. And I guess our argument is if we leave some of the spectrum and allow it to be done in an unlicensed way, we will open up an enormous amount of innovation, both in terms of wireless broadband in rural areas, first responder applications, and a whole other applications we just can't even imagine today. So with that, I want to turn it over to Congressman Inslee, and he will talk a little bit about his legislation and his thoughts on this. So, Congressman, thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thanks. This is a treat. I get to talk about something very near and dear to my heart and many of my constituents. We are talking about, I think, a very important issue in the country right now. And basically the question is, can we free this great spectrum up from innovation without interfering with Americans' most highly valued asset in their life? And that is, of course, the ability to watch the unfolding O.J. and Britney Spears stories on our TV, and of course that is the highest valued aspect of American life that we have, and so this is a serious question. And so I want to address this by talking about maybe two white spaces to show why I favor rapid deployment of an ability to use spectrum in the white spaces. And I want to talk about two white spaces. One white space is that's very unhealthy, and one white space is that's going to be very healthy and very productive. The white spaces that are unhealthy are the white spaces up in the Arctic right now. You may have read that the Arctic just lost 1 million square miles of ice, disappeared in one summer. It's never ever happened before as far as we can tell. The Arctic melted an area the size of 6 Californias. It totally shocked scientists, and the consensus view is that that's caused by global warming. So you've got unhealthy white spaces. And then you've got some other white spaces that can help solve that problem. And you might not think those are connected, but I want to posit why they may be connected. I've been working on a project called the New Apollo Energy Project for a few years to try to develop a clean energy future for the country. And actually just wrote a book about that subject. It's called Apollo's Fire. And we went around and we talked to technologists about how we're going to develop a new clean energy future. And one of the things that these technologists told me is that one of the pivotal things that we need to develop is an interconnectivity between all of our appliances in our homes and businesses and our utility, so that we eventually can start regulating the use of our electrical grid in a way that will save electricity, so that, let's say we're having too much demand on the grid at a certain time, we can have a connection with your water heater to sort of slow down the heating of your water heating, take some of the load off the grid. Or if we want to handle the heat in your house, we want to have a connection between your thermostat and the grid, so that even when you're away from the home, you can maintain the environment of your home in a comfortable and energy efficient way. Well, what do you need to do that? You need spectrum, and you need white spaces, and we need the FCC to move forward to come up with a rule that will allow this valuable turf to be utilized. And I think the metaphor of the freeway is apt. Right now, you look at the demand for access with these emerging technologies, and it is like people who are sitting on the on-ramp to the freeway, bottled up, bumper to bumper, watching one car go by every 5 minutes, with this rule that has this enormous space between cars that could be used that is not used right now. And that is a government failure. It's a failure of government to really allow the power of innovation to be maximized in using this spectrum. And my view is sort of my job. I'm from Redmond, home of Microsoft and a few other high-tech companies. And my job, as I see it, is to free the geniuses all around me. I'm not one of them. I like to think I represent them, because every time I go home, I go to the grocery store and I run into somebody who's coming up with some whiz-bang technology that I have a hard time even understanding. But it does seem to me that Congress does have a responsibility to free American innovative talent, and that should be our principal occupation here, is to maximize the intellectual capabilities of Americans. And since I've been working on this, people have come up to me with applications of the white spaces, that I would never imagine. Maybe these are obvious to you. If you think about rural broadband deployment, the possibilities there, public safety communications applications, which are abundant, the personal consumer applications you can hardly even imagine, thinking about how far electronics has come. And I look at this sort of white spaces a little bit like people ask you, well, why do you need white spaces? Isn't it kind of premature, and how do you know it's really going to develop into mature technology? And it reminds me of the Ben Franklin quote when he was in Paris, and he watched the very first higher balloon went up, the very first lighter-than-air vehicle mankind ever launched. And somebody turned to Franklin and said, well, what's the purpose of that? And Franklin said, well, what are the purposes of a baby? And I think that that's true about white spaces as well, that I believe can launch 1,000 new technologies, many of which we can't even dream of, from security applications to mesh networks to municipalities now trying to establish their broadband networks. So I've introduced a bill that basically would call for a rulemaking to move forward in this regard to encourage the FCC to move. Now, of course, we've had the first cut at the machine and the technology that will do that. And as folks have heard, it did not go perfectly. Like the first version of many things did not go perfectly. We now have a new cut at that is going to be in the field shortly, and we hope that it'll be more successful. We've learned some things. Actually, at the first go-around, although it did not work perfectly, did prove the concept, and there was some positive news in that regard. So this is a technological issue. It will have a technological solution. We're encouraging the FCC to move forward rapidly to get that second cut at this technology to get that job done. And I'm fairly confident that that will occur. In going forward, I think it's important to say that we have some important principles in advancing this. Of course, we're only going to advance it if it doesn't result in disruption of people's other uses of other spectrum. That's a given. We all understand that. Nobody wants to trample on somebody else's technology that's effective today, and we're going to presume the FCC is going to have the capability of determining that's not going to happen. But I'm very excited about the prospect that Congress can help the FCC move forward on this so we can get this job done as quickly as possible. So bad news in the Arctic, good news for white spaces telephonically and electronically, and I'll look forward to your questions.
Do you have time to take one or do you want to take one?
You know, if I can take questions.
Yeah, why don't we do that?
Yeah.
I think the Congress is going to have to leave in a few minutes, so if you want to ask just a few questions, we'll go ahead.
My question.
Can you identify yourself?
Ted Hearn with Multi-Channel News. My question here is that this is a baby step. What you really should be concentrating on is this fact. Within 5 or 10 years, pay TV penetration in this country is going to be so high that broadcasters will be virtually broadcasting to nobody except the cable and satellite people who retransmit their signal. Why aren't the big brains up on Capitol Hill at this table working on a bigger project, which is to migrate broadcasters off of that spectrum so that hundreds of millions of people can use wireless devices, just looking at the numbers?
Well, I think your question answered itself when you said big brains in Congress. That's sort of eliminated the potential authors for this. I think it's a really good question. It's not one really I've thought much about, and now I'm going to go home and start doing that. But this is first steps first. And we want to show that, your sanguine view that there's going to be that transition, I don't think is shared by my friends in the broadcast industry necessarily. And I just think that it's way premature to say that we're going to jump over white spaces in some massive reallocation like that. So that's the best answer I can give to you. I will consult big brains if I find them, and I will give some thought to that.
Other questions?
Move back in the corner.
James Steiner from the Institute for Telecommunication. You expressed the standard that if there's any interference to an incumbent, the white spaces are off the table. Can we just pose a hypothetical to you, to say using the first adjacent channel? If 1 out of a million current users is harmfully damaged intermittently, maybe a few hours a day, somebody is using white spaces, so there is some harmful interference to the incumbent. But you now double the amount of spectrum that's usable in that band because the most valuable spectrum is the first adjacent channel. Is that a trade-off you'd be willing to consider? One is the social welfare analysis that to benefit 99.99% of America, you'll allow a little harm for the remainder. So that's a versus this absolute standard.
Right.
What is your standard?
Well, I would certainly make that trade-off, particularly if that 1 in a million is in somebody else's district. I think it's somewhat easier. That isn't, I think it's posed in that sense. I think it's a trade-off most members of the U.S. Congress would make if that's the situation. But the people that I'm talking to in this business were telling me that they believe this technology is possible without any meaningful interruption, that anyone would be willing to write a letter to gripe about the FCC. They believe that we can get to that technological occurrence. And if you found the 1 in a million, maybe that would occur. But I guess what I'm saying is that when I said this is a technological problem, a technological solution, that's what we in Congress like to see, because we don't have to make those value judgments that you're talking about. And what I'm being told is that technological solution people believe is attainable if we'll get a rule to define it. And so I'm looking for that to occur. Thank you very much. I look forward to good ideas.
All right, thank you, Congressman Lindsay, for joining us. Our next speaker will be Peter Camillo.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. Robert, you may have mentioned, you did. We are Shared Spectrum Company is a small startup based out in Tysons Corner, Virginia. We've been at the spectrum access game since about 2000. My boss, Mark Henry, started the company when he discovered a lot of unused open spectrum poles after doing a lot of measurements. And so that's kind of really how we got started, doing a lot of measurements and seeing that one of the opportunities was gaps in the TV bands. And it was, I think, back into about 2000 when Shared Spectrum filed comments at the FCC in the SDR, software-defined radio proceeding, suggesting this notion of opening up the white spaces in the TV band for others to provide access to. So, this, from our perspective, goes back a long way. But since then, over the last few years, we've grown substantially to about 30-some people, and we've got ourselves a big DoD contract funded by DARPA. It's called the XG program for Next Generation. Before I go any further, I want everybody to make it crystal clear to everybody that whatever I say here, or do, or infer, imply, or you might think, is on my own behalf and not on behalf of DARPA, the DoD, or any of our other customers. So please understand that disclaimer. I became familiar with the XG program back in, and Robert told me about it, wanted me to talk about interference. And the XG program was about a next generation radio system that really did away with the old notion of managing interference. And the way you manage interference was static allocations and assignments of distinct radio frequencies to particular people or particular services. That's why you have a TV band in the first place. That's why you have channels. That's why you have assignments, and that's why you have licenses. And that dates back to the 1920s. But technology's come a long way, as we know, since then. And so we're looking to see how we can take advantage of Moore's Law and the increase in processing power to be able to have smart radios, also known as cognitive radios. Yes, they're also software defined. So the software can make very smart hardware, by the increasing, I don't want to be technical, I'm trying to avoid a technical term here. Increase in processing power of, chips and devices, and we see it every day with the advent of, a new device that comes along and just blows our socks off. Who knows what's going to be like in 3-5 years from now. So what we're doing is using software to put inside that processing the ability to sense where that open spectrum is. And the XG program is in a military context, designed to find that in a very, very frequency hostile environment where you've got enemies, using their radios and things called jammers against you, and you've got allies that have their own radio systems that they got from their own manufacturers, and you've got, in the military here, various services and platforms, aerial, ground, mobile, fixed type platforms. Very difficult radio environment. So that's what we're developing technology for, is so that the military can have an increase within their own spectrum. They got a lot. Within their own spectrum, they can increase their capacity by at least 10 times. So we've shown that in our demonstrations much more. So what we're doing is building prototype radios and developing software that can do this, that can sense where nobody is using the radios. And if we detect an existing radio coming on that we need to protect, we get out. If we detect one that we just need to avoid because it's going to cause interference to us, the radio also moves to another band. Or it might just reduce its bandwidth a little bit and send the data a little slower. Here, can you hand me my water, please? Sorry about that. When I talk about XG, I really get laughed out. I don't know why I'm talking this thing because it doesn't work. Okay, we're back. So we're talking about TV. That was our commercial break. We're back. We were talking about XG, and what we did last summer, Cherry Spectrum Company, on behalf of DARPA, as part of the XG program, did a field test with 6 of our prototype nodes running around Army base in a mobile environment and avoiding a bunch of different types of legacy military radios. So as we would come up on a legacy radio, we would switch channel. The legacy radio was on, we'd switch channels, and so on. So we demonstrated that the ability to do 3 things. One, the number one objective was cause no harm, i.e. interference. And second was add value, that is, increase the capacity. And the other one was, which maybe should be the first one, it works. We achieved all milestones, and now what we're doing is we're on the next step. We're increasing the amount of nodes to 25, so we're going to be networking 25 nodes in a variety of kind of scenarios, and so we're going to be starting this fall having more field demonstrations and developing that. And what those radios will do, what these prototypes will do, we'll have the ability to use multiple bands. Not just the DoDs, well, all of the DoD bands, which go from 255 megahertz up to about 2 gigahertz, maybe 3 gigahertz, depends on which little card we put in the device. Our first prototypes were like, we had to push around grocery carts. These ones will be about the size of a cable modem, because we shrunk it all down into digital cards. So that's the way of technology. Just in the year and a half that I've been at this company, since I left the FCC, that's how fast this technology has moved. And it is amazing. We're also developing a prototype radio that would work in the TV bands. And of course, we cannot deploy that or sell it to anybody that wants to deploy it or use software to control that until, one, the FCC rules, or and when we know what those rules are and what they mean and stuff like that. And there's going to be a lot of process after it. When I was at the FCC, we did a lot of different new types of uses of radio, including sharing, like in the sharing with DoD radar bands. So, and in that case, it took us a long process, a lot of steps. We got down to the nitty-gritty, and there ended up being a consensus approach for testing these devices, for what the parameters should be. But you know what? They're fixed. There's still static regulations in place. For example, when you sense for 3 minutes or whatever the case may be, stay off for 30 minutes, and that's the case would be. So if and when those rules would change, because we realize that, hey, we can operate, still in a safe mode with these radars, with these dynamic frequency selection radios, how are we going to do that? So what we've done as part of the XG program and another programs, a couple other follow-on programs, is develop software where you take the regulation, whatever the regulation, where it comes from the FCC, may come from a spectrum owner, because you're leasing spectrum from that spectrum owner, and you're using it on a secondary basis. But whatever those rules are, you put them in software, policy. So the policy controls the radio. And so if the FCC changes the rules from 30 minutes to 15 minutes, you don't have to recall all the radios, or you don't have to just wait till the next product cycle to put those new devices out. What you do is you just send a new software update to all the radios or a policy update, and now they work under the new rules. That goes the other way too. If you figure out that the devices, well, we weren't careful enough with those devices, or in setting the parameters for the devices, or there's been new products introduced, or new services introduced by the incumbent that are a little more sensitive to those devices. Let's send a policy out that makes these the sensing of these radios a little better. So let's update the software without recalling the devices, updating the devices. So you don't have or there's too many interference events. So you don't have to recall those devices. I remember I worked on a case at the FCC involving radar detectors. We're causing interference with satellite dishes. There was nothing we could do. There were so many out there already. We just basically said to like Radio Shack and others, you got to take it off the shelf. And the manufacturers, you got to stop making these things. That's not an answer anymore. You got to be able to sell devices to folks that are going to work and can be updated, just like the computer can. Your virus software, it's going to be safe. Your computer is operating safely. Your radio needs to operate safely. Not necessarily in order to protect, whoever you're sharing the band with, but for God's sake, to work. That's what you're selling the radios for. So that's kind of the new business perspective I picked up. So that's the other element we're working on. So interference avoidance and policy control. Those are the two main components. Going back to interference avoidance. You can take three perspectives about interference. And I should say, I look at it from it's really harmful interference. And I used to have the definition of it memorized. This really isn't, but people used to laugh at me whenever I would recite it, so I forgot the whole definition of what harmful interference was. But that's what we're basically trying to do here. Avoiding harmful interference. Because there's interference. There's interference right now within the white spaces, just with the things from your computers and all other various noise sources. But the TVs are able to, or whatever devices are using it, wireless microphone, are built to, be tolerant to those levels of interference. So the key is how to avoid harmful interference to those existing devices, and I would suggest future devices. So let me just wrap up with these three perspectives on, and we're hearing this a lot, I'm just kind of observing it a lot in the white spaces proceeding. Okay, the engineering perspective, like Congressman said, yeah, sure, it's a technical problem with a technical solution, but engineers are going to differ over what the parameters are going to be, what's reasonable parameter, what is harmful interference. So, but there are I think there is immense room for compromise here. So, maybe it's about getting engineers in a room together and hashing out what they can live with. And you start with, one gating factor. How do you prevent, how do you make sure you're sensing? Say, okay, I don't sense anything. Should I do something else? Should I have a geographic geolocation approach? There's many, many approaches. We've got 19 different policy rules that we've developed to put in this policy. Listen to Fort Talk is one of them. Geolocation. We have a concept called group behavior or collaborative sensing, where you increase the sensing capability exponentially by just having a few more folks out there listening. A probe or a control channel approach, where you have other folks out there listening for you and sending a signal to you saying the coast is clear. Go ahead. Go like that when I'm out of time. Am I out of time?
One more minute.
Okay. Two other perspectives, which I will do in 30 seconds. One is legal, regulatory, policy perspective. And that's the whole notion of the lawyers love that vague definition because they're going to fight over it, fight over it, fight over it. So until there's kind of like a understanding of where there's, where it's what's in it for me, they're not going to get together. They're always going to try to polarize these sides. And so I just want to suggest maybe there's room for an honest broker here that doesn't have to muss up the legal and regulatory process and get down to the engineering brass tacks. And the third perspective, briefly, is economic, and that's the business case. And you can't, what is the business case under various parameters? Every increase of regulation increases cost. So, from a business perspective, we're going to say, what's the business case? And I'd say, what's in it for the incumbents? The reason that in 5 gigahertz in that band, they were able to reach consensus there on the technical rules was because DoD, who had radars, also had a use for the devices in the 5 gigahertz band. How can we reach out to the broadcast side and figure out, okay, they're really working hard to develop a mobile video platform to I guess, complement their existing platform. Doesn't white spaces fit in there somehow, maybe as a return path, or some way that it adds value to them, not just as a guard band or a buffer zone, that is a no man's zone? Can it be used somehow to add value to their existing platforms? I don't know, but I think there's got to be a business case in there somewhere because you know what? As a small business, as an entrepreneur wanting to grow, I want more people to sell to our software so that controls these devices and that avoids causing harmful interference. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, everybody, for dedicating a lunch hour to spending some time to learning a little bit more about this topic and trying to understand what the opportunities are. It's almost exactly a year since I was here talking about the white spaces up on the Hill, and I think that we've actually made very good progress. It's true, I come from the software industry originally where there's this notion of internet years. Here I think there's a notion of beltway years, and they work slightly differently from internet years. But I think in the last 12 months, the debate has matured considerably. I think the technology has emerged, and we're ready to actually push the last 10 yards. What I'd like to do in my 15 minutes is leave you with 3 ideas. The first is that unlicensed is a very good way to allocate spectrum. It's very useful. Second, that both unlicensed and flexible use license that you buy at auction are both very good ways to use spectrum. And when you need to wait to choose which one you're going to do in a particular allocation. And the third point is that in the case of the white spaces specifically, unlicensed is the best option. So let's just start with a thought experiment. By show of hands, has anybody in this room used these wireless phone headsets? Spotlight thing. Okay, so quite a few of you. Anybody used their laptops in a coffee shop or at home, in the office downstairs? So actually more. Anybody used a cordless phone at home? Actually, now this is actually interesting about this audience. Fewer people use the cordless phone than use the Wi-Fi laptop. But the experiment isn't the show of hands. The experiment is, imagine that somebody throws a big red switch in the sky, and tomorrow none of this technology exists. And in fact, the way the switch got flipped was somebody got in a time machine and went back and shot Mike Marcus. And the kind of rules that we got that allowed the unlicensed use of spectrum for these kinds of technologies never happened. The industrial, scientific, and medical bands were licensed. They were sold at auction in some way, and we never had this technology that we all use. I think that would be a great loss, because there are kinds of innovation that you get with unlicensed that you do not get any other way. Rob gave some examples. The congressman gave some examples. I'm not going to add to the list. We've just demonstrated that we all understand what that list is. But just in short, there's been a massive explosion in devices, 60 billion Wi-Fi devices out there. Bluetooth, the little blinking blue light on your ear. 1 billion devices so far and counting very rapidly. And companies have made big technology investments. The speed of Wi-Fi has grown by 50-fold since the technology was first introduced. So clearly there's a great amount of use
for these things. You've got license, though, as well. There's innovation. Just think about the iPhone. That's happened in license spectrum. And there is a great value in license spectrum, too. But one has to think about how they differ. And the story I heard from Ian Farrell, I think, helped me to understand this better. Imagine that you want to go to the seaside. You've got a choice. You can go to a wonderful private resort. You can book a room. You open the door in the morning. You're on the beach. You walk out on the beach. The beach has been swept. It's clean. Your towel is there waiting for you. There's somebody ready to serve you a cool, frosty beverage. It's a wonderful experience. Costs you a lot of money, but a wonderful experience. On the other hand, you might say, gee, I just want to go down to the beach with the kids. Everybody piles into the car. You dive down to a public beach. If it's a very nice day, you probably struggle to get parking. There's congestion. You get to the beach, it might be full. There might be somebody who's playing a radio very loudly next to you. That's not to say that everybody should always want to go to a private resort. It's good to have the option to have both. And in fact, it turns out that as a society, we have many things that we handle this way. The Congressman mentioned roads. We've got parks. Another one that I think is quite interesting is intellectual property. There is copyright, patents, intellectual property, but at the same time, there's also a public domain for intellectual property. And it's the combination of the two that gives us the greatest social value. So you then get to the question of, well, how do you choose in the case of spectrum whether to have licensed or unlicensed? I think the debate has actually moved along quite a bit in the last few years. My impression is that there really are very few people left on either side who say either that everything should be licensed or everything should be unlicensed. It's difficult, though, for economists to sign on to unlicensed. My impression as a non-economist is that economists love numbers. They love to measure things and put prices on things. With unlicensed spectrum, you can't do that. So you can't draw a demand curve. You can't easily calculate the consumer surplus. There have been a few studies to try and do this. The best one that I've seen was done by the British regulator, the equivalent of the FCC. Over the last year, they actually funded some studies to look at the consumer value of licensed and unlicensed spectrum. And they, in fact, did the revenue that people would get from applications over 20 years for Wi-Fi-like applications and cellular applications. Now, you're projecting over 20 years, and only an economist has the guts to do that. But it turns out that within the ranges that people got for those two sets of numbers, they overlap. Can you use that to say one is better than the other? In general, no. Both licensed and unlicensed generate consumer surplus, generate consumer value. One of the interesting things, though, is the different way they do that. People have said to me, well, it's crazy to have this spectrum in the white spaces. Why don't we just auction it and get the money, bring it to Congress and spend it? Well, that's one way to get the consumer surplus, because the companies that bid at auction will bid exactly as much as that spectrum is going to be worth to their business. And in fact, all the value of that spectrum is going to be in the auction price if the auction is properly run. So all that money is going to come to Congress. And the Hill is going to decide in its inimitable way how to efficiently and fairly spend that money. Now, we know from all the studies, from the Ofcom studies, for example, that unlicensed has a roughly equivalent amount of consumer surplus. You don't see that money showing up on Capitol Hill. Instead, it goes directly into the pocket of the consumer when they buy a compliant device that can operate in unlicensed spectrum. So, when we have these two choices, why should we have unlicensed? Well, there's the reasons that we had about innovation. Edge innovation. You also have managed innovation when you get a device from a network operator, cellular. You get very interesting applications. But there are many applications where you don't need a network operator. There doesn't need to be a manager of the resource to make the decisions for you. The connection between your ear and your phone, the connection between your laptop and your home base station, building a neighborhood network. You don't need a central network operator for that. If you want to have a network that's going to be absolutely predictable, it's always going to work nationwide, like making a cell phone call. Well, actually, that doesn't always work, but it works sufficiently often. Then, in fact, licensed is a very good choice. That then leaves us the question Given that both are good, which one do we pick for the white spaces? So, in fact, in the TV bands, so-called, the ultra-high frequency bands, UHF, we do, in fact, now have both on the table. There is going to be an auction very soon of spectrum in the 700 megahertz band. That's going to go in license, flexible use, tradable licenses. That's great. That leaves us the white spaces, and I believe that unlicensed will work there very well. We've heard about all the different ways you can innovate. It's impossible to predict what the baby is going to do, so I'm not going to spend much time on that. Rather, I just want to focus on the nature of that band and the nature of the unlicensed technology as a generic way of solving a technical and business problem. When the 2.4 gigahertz band that we now use for Wi-Fi first became available, it used to be called, I'm told, a jump band. And I guess it was called a jump band because it was messy, there was microwave, there were all sorts of hospital equipment that one shouldn't interfere with, and it was hard to see how you could use it. History has been written, there's been good uses for that. And so what that showed is that unlicensed technology can make use of a difficult band. The UHF bands, where we have television, is a difficult band. There are incumbents that absolutely have to be protected. Broadcast television, licensed wireless microphones. Another problem that you have in that band is that in major metropolitan areas, all the bands that are unused by TV broadcasts, not all of them, but pretty much all of them, are adjacent to TV broadcasts. And because TV sets are not very good at rejecting electrical energy, one has to be very careful when broadcasting next to a TV band, not even in the TV band, that you don't interfere with somebody watching television. The way you do that is you use very low power, and that, again, is a hallmark of unlicensed. The other situation that you find is that these white spaces are different in every place. Every city you go, every place you go, it's a different mix. Some channels are occupied here, but they're taken somewhere else. And so how do you navigate your way through that? Technology helps us to do that. In fact, the technology that you need to operate in the white spaces is really simple. I don't think one needs much, if any, of the wonderful technology that Peter described that the DoD needs for the very hostile environment that it's operating in. TV stations don't change very often. Wireless mics, though, do. They come and go. So one needs to be able to detect them. And one has to be able to detect TV signals in curious edge cases. So imagine there's an antenna on the roof, and the white space device is on the ground floor in the basement. If it doesn't see the TV signal that you can see with the antenna on the roof, you have a problem. So the technology that's being demonstrated to the FCC now is able to detect TV signals 1,000 times weaker than a TV can in fact decode and show us a picture. And I'm persuaded that that's going to be sufficient to protect TV incumbents. It's not my decision to make. The FCC is going to go out and do the measurements, and it's going to decide. And in fact, to the earlier question to the Congressman, the people who are going to make the trade-off about harmful interference is going to be the FCC, and it's going to be a balance of interest and what is in the public interest in the end. So, last comment, just to think a little bit about the alternative of licensed allocations in the white spaces. There have been some very thoughtful papers examining that and making proposals about that. I believe that there are severe difficulties. I think it's going to be very difficult to define the property rights that you will auction because the spectrum is so messy. The right is going to vary from city to city because in some places a band will be available, in other places it won't. Another problem will be that the rights that you have will change over time. Somebody might have a right at auction that they thought they bought in a given channel. The FCC allocates another TV license. Suddenly they don't have that right anymore. Somebody uses a wireless mic. Suddenly that right goes away because one has to defer to the licensed wireless mic application. So in general, I believe that one can imagine ways of auctioning that spectrum. There are very clever people in this town, but I don't see how it's practicable. So in conclusion, unlicensed spectrum in general generates innovation that we don't get in any other way. we have to make a choice in the case of the white spaces between licensed and unlicensed. And for technological reasons and reasons of innovation, I believe that unlicensed is the best option for us in the white space. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Michael Calabrese with New America Foundation, and Pierre reminds me that actually his paper that we published, which is a more extensive discussion of many of the points he made, is out on the table in case you missed it on the way in. It's really one of the best, on this topic. Well, I represent, in sort of standing here, I feel I represent, I haven't necessarily been voted to do this, but represent the Public Interest Spectrum Coalition. There's been a lot of attention to the companies, this sort of industry food fight, but the Public Interest Coalition includes, dozens of consumer, higher education, rural and mini broadband, media reform, civil rights, digital divide, and local technology groups that, are supporting opening this white space for broadband deployment and innovation. So I'd like to close by highlighting why these diverse, broad-based groups believe that unlicensed access to the white space will bring, tremendous social and economic benefits. First, smart radio, as we've heard from Peter primarily, smart radio technologies make it possible to detect and share these unused frequencies. And it's just worth reiterating that this is very well established, not only from DARPA's XG program, which did a public demonstration that was attended by folks from the FCC and others, but also in the 5 gigahertz band, which is the higher frequency band that after some negotiation with industry, much testing, the military opened for unlicensed sharing with military radar, which seems to be a much tougher sharing arrangement. And generally, the opportunity loss of leaving the spectrum fallow is just, really mounting every day. Spectrum is the ultimate in renewable resources. Second factor is the TV band is a vast wasteland. And Rob mentioned this at the beginning, that every one of the nation's 210 local TV markets will have anywhere from 15 to 40 unassigned and vacant channels that are reserved for broadcasting but not in use at the end of the DTV transition. So once we hit February 2009, there will be a tremendous amount of this wasted capacity if we don't make use of it. And we did a study mapping this in many of the major markets, and it ranges from a low of a 30% vacancy rate in a congested coastal city like Trenton, New Jersey, where 15 channels will be unassigned, to more than 60% in markets like Richmond, Virginia, and Columbia, South Carolina, to more than 80% vacant in Fargo, North Dakota, and other very rural areas. Third, although this spectrum is Swiss cheese, right, and as Pierre mentioned, making it very difficult to define license rights, and as Chairman Martin said, it would require a couple of years delay at a minimum to even figure out how you could possibly license it. It's uniquely suited for very low power and localized uses, which is exactly where unlicensed is thriving today. So in rural areas, the propagation characteristics of these low frequencies, right, are great for distance, for going distance with the same cost of equipment, covering large areas. In all areas, it's great for penetration. In other words, you can get through trees, you can get through, around inside homes and offices much more easily with large amounts of data. In both cases, this reduces cost and improves coverage. Fourth, the white spaces are needed, for those very reasons, to complete the unlicensed ecosystem. Okay, so right now, when all these network operators go out there, and I'll mention some of them in a minute, what they have available to work with is the 2.4 gigahertz band, right, which we've all been talking about, the so-called jump band that was set aside years ago for baby monitors, cordless phones, microwave ovens, and that's where Wi-Fi grew up. That's a pretty good band, but it's higher frequency than cell phones. The penetration is not nearly as good. The distances aren't nearly as good, and it has a slight problem of being shared with 300 million consumer devices that are also operating there. Then there's the 5 gigahertz, the other unlicensed band, which is much larger, but it's such a high frequency that while it's good for backhaul, you need to have point-to-point transmission. In other words, you have to be able to see. You can't go through things like trees. It's line of sight. So the TV band, any spectrum at these very low frequencies would sort of fill out the toolkit for broadband operators and home networks and business to help bring us innovation. Fifth, when airwaves are unlicensed, they become directly available to network operators, from home and business networks to downtown hotspots and networks covering even entire counties. So that's the ultimate in deregulation. As Pierre noted, requiring a government license and therefore a middleman inhibits innovation in consumer services. I mean, just think if the 2.4 gigahertz band was licensed, how many people would want to go out and subscribe and pay CBS or AT&T for a baby monitor subscription service or a cordless phone service or a Wi-Fi service? Basically, it just wouldn't happen. So who really benefits if we open these white spaces? We talked, it seems like what gets all the attention is the remaining 13% of households that watch TV over the air. And to the extent that there's risk to them, that's what all the testing is about. But you want to look at the 100% of households that benefit. The proponents getting most of the attention, however, are the big Silicon Valley companies, Intel, Microsoft, Dell, and others, that make the devices, chips, and software and have the resources to lobby in D.C. But the greatest beneficiaries are the constituents of the groups in our coalition, particularly rural and inner city consumers, students, small businesses, and others who are disadvantaged most as America falls further and further behind on broadband access and cost compared to our leading competitors. So first, the most obvious beneficiary is rural broadband deployment. And that's why you have associations who've joined us, in supporting us, such as WISPA, the Wireless Internet Service Provider Association. There's more than 3,000 of these WISPs. They're mostly mom and pop, although some are big, and they're mostly in rural areas, such as Roadstar, for example, up in the Blue Ridge area. They cover an area between Leesburg and Charlottesville, basically bringing internet access to farms and homes, small businesses up there where there's no, where it's too far even for DSL or cable or other things, and they're big proponents of this. The National Telecom Cooperative Association, these are the 1,200 rural local exchange carriers. They serve over 14 million Americans in rural and small town areas. They support this. They took a survey and found over 60% of their members are using unlicensed spectrum to reach remote customers, and would use it much more if they had this low frequency spectrum that went through trees and over greater distances. The WISPs also rely almost completely on unlicensed, by the way. The biggest challenge, as I said, is trees, but also capital costs. When you don't have density, the reason you don't see the incumbent carriers and so on out in these areas is because there's not enough density to justify the capital costs compared to, say, suburbs and cities. So with the TV white space, you can cover at least 4 times the area for the same capital cost, which keeps costs lower and spurs deployment. Second, the white space will also be rocket fuel for municipal and county-wide broadband efforts. There are literally hundreds of these efforts underway today. And although some of the bigger ones, Philadelphia, Chicago, now putting a hold on theirs, that gets the publicity. There are networks that have been up and running and successful now for a couple of years. In St. Cloud, Florida, for example, they have over 70% of the adults in St. Cloud have already signed up and are using their free 1 megabit per second symmetrical wireless broadband service, which they don't charge for. They do it just as a public service. In Morrow and Umatilla counties in rural northeast Oregon, a 600-square-mile network that was originally built for public safety reasons is now open, free for individuals and for a small charge to businesses. And farmers are using it, for example, to control their irrigation equipment and monitor their crops, from laptops. And these are two counties that have one stoplight between them. In the south side of Chicago, the Center for Neighborhood Technology has, put up a mesh wireless network based on technology. Actually, it was developed by my colleague Sasha Meinrath at the Champaign-Urbana Wireless Network. And it's a neighborhood that's 50% below the poverty line, and yet has free, blazing fast Wi-Fi, in a very disadvantaged area. A third group of beneficiaries are public safety, the public safety community. Dozens of wireless public safety data networks operating on unlicensed spectrum are up and running nationwide, even as we have this whole debate about the 700 band public safety and what we're going to do about it. These places like Corpus Christi, Texas, San Mateo, California, Pratt, Kansas, and on, have moved ahead. There's actually a policy backgrounder about that on the table outside. Corpus Christi, Texas is a great example. The CTO has been to the Hill a couple times to speak about how they really need, more low-frequency spectrum, such as the TV white space, to make that data network even better. It's one of the largest ports in the country, and what they have is they have a mobile data network. So every public safety vehicle has broadband on board with in-car streaming video. On the way, fire trucks on the way to a fire can download blueprints for the building. Police can download mugshots, criminal records. They have an aerial surveillance drone. Every time there's an incident, this pilotless drone sends streaming video to the command center using Wi-Fi. Fourth is an area of education, EduCause, which represents higher education in the United States on technology issues, right? The CIOs of the nation's colleges and universities, they're very active supporters of this. And of course they would be, right? Because the top 100 public universities have an average of 2,000 access points, which is more than the number of cell towers in America. Roughly 50% of university classrooms have wireless broadband. And what they're looking for, again, is better coverage, lower costs, and to increase their capacity as there's more and more, data being, thrown around. So MIT, for example, has 3,000 access points. It's put a high-speed cloud over much of Cambridge around the university. EduCause has argued that access to white space will be needed if we're going to move from bring this innovation from campuses down to make high schools and middle schools wireless, so that every student can be sitting in a classroom, on a laptop. Then there's small business. Today, already over 60% of U.S. companies use wireless networking over unlicensed spectrum. 30% employ voice over wireless local area networks. Okay, but what's being left behind in many cases are small business. So another big supporter of this has been CompTIA, the Computer Technology Industry Association, which represents the 32,000 value-added retailers in America. It's a $43 billion industry that basically wires and increasingly wants to unwire the nation's small and medium-sized businesses and professional offices in every town. So, for example, already where it's possible, you have networks going to places like dentist's office, where there's a chip on his drill bit, and an email pops up when it's time to replace the bit. I mean, just one example of hundreds of productivity-enhancing things that would happen if these networks were cheaper and more efficient. And then finally, the most obvious one, of course, is consumers, which is why Consumers Union, Consumer Federation, and others have been big advocates of this. And it's not only doing things like moving video files around the home from from the computer to the TV set downstairs, but it's also the whole notion of pervasive connectivity, of being able to carry, a device that, wherever you go can move in and out of, maybe it's in and out of hotspots, maybe it's on and off a network you pay for so that you pay less, but the idea that you can always be online anywhere, and more likely with unlicensed spectrum, that you can have a peer-to-peer communication. You don't even need to go through some paid network to communicate with devices that are in range, to swap, whether it's swapping songs or simply having a voice or texting conversation without going through the internet to do that. So anyway, this is a whole package of benefits, and I'll stop there so that we can take your questions.
Michael, thank you. We're going to have a hard stop at 2:30, so we have about 15 minutes for questions or any comments.
Yes, Philip Weber, Congressional Budget Office. This is a question from Mr. Tempula, and that is, I was busily watching something else this summer, and I, out of my corner of my ear, heard something the Congressman referred to, that it was that the FCC flunked the first generation of the DTV white space devices. Could you just, for those of us who didn't pay attention, lay out what went on? Then I know some people said no, they didn't really flunk, you all just didn't do it right. Could you just lay that out?
I'll lay it out as much as I understand it as a kind of observer that was paying attention this summer, along with, watching my kids and things like that as well. And I did take a visit up to the FCC lab, where they did have a meeting kind of to debrief everybody once those reports came out. So, and here I think may have followed it a little too, and made other insight as well that let him answer. But the situation was this: when the FCC proposed its rules in September 2006, it said, well, what we're going to do is, to the extent that there are devices that people are developing, companies are developing, we'd like to test them to see what kind of parameters, work and would make sense. And so I think two companies took up that invitation and submitted devices. And one involved a device that had both transmitting and receiving and sensing capabilities, and the other one just had sensing capabilities. Apparently, the one that had, we called it WSD1, I guess, device 1, had, I couldn't make sure, I didn't want to endorse any particular brand or company, but two companies did step up to the plate and said, we'll have our devices tested. And the FCC tested them and came out with a report in fairly short order that said we couldn't get the Microsoft device to sense at the parameters, the level of sensing and the sensing threshold that it said it could operate at. But on the Philips device, which is the other company, we did. So they were able to sense at the sensing threshold. Whether that sensing threshold is enough to avoid causing interference, I'm not sure they addressed that question. But I think Microsoft later came in and said, well, it wasn't working right. It was malfunctioning. So, but when it was run properly, it sensed the right thing. So whether it flunked or was incomplete, I think that the first word of that report, I think, was preliminary or interim or something like that, and it was couched in all types of caveats. So if you really want to know the whole story, for a technical report, it's fairly easy read. The folks that I've worked with them, the folks up there are fairly good writers most of the time, and we know that report probably went through a very short time. I mean, the process was very short, involving the testing, and then the report drafting and review and stuff like that probably took maybe 3 times as long. So I'm just guessing on that.
So is that 1,000th of the number that was thrown around here earlier? That was the threshold they tried to test that.
Mine's 114.
Yeah, right. In other words, what that is that at that point 1,000 times more sensitive. It can detect a signal that's 1,000 times weaker than what DTV needs to actually display a picture. And the important point I would add to this, I think what Peter said, is that the point of it is that, really a DOE's work there was to determine feasibility. In other words, is it feasible to detect TV signals even where there's tremendous propagation loss? In other words, even where the white space device is in the basement and the antenna's on the roof. And so, it's no surprise that Philips' device clearly showed the feasibility because, in fact, the FCC's Office of Technology knows the feasibility because they've been there at the DARPA demonstrations, for example. It's just very well known. But the Microsoft device apparently malfunctioned. They've since last week, I guess, 10 days ago, delivered new results, and now the FCC has agreed to go out and retest both the Microsoft and the Philips device, both in the lab and in the field to see if that gets past the rate this time.
Other comments or questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, Chuck Jackson, consultant, PCC consultant. Chuck Jackson. Question for Michael. You described the use of this white space for providing connectivity in the house or connectivity inside high schools. And are you trying to tell me that high schools can't use 802.11 today, or that 802.11 is going to have wider bandwidth than anything you build in white space?
Oh, sure they can use it. That was why I was saying what we want is low frequency spectrum to complete the ecosystem. In other words, they have low, you might call in oversimplified terms, I'm a lawyer, not an engineer, low, medium, and high frequency unlicensed, so that you can put together, networks that, that trade off on those things. So you can use the high for backhaul, but you use the low frequency for what you might call the last 100 yards because it can penetrate. So if you're in a high school situation with thick cement walls and 30 kids, unfortunately you're in public schools like my kids are, 30 kids in the seats. What you're talking about is that you want both high penetration and a lot of bandwidth. And you have neither of those with today's 2.4. It's not going to get through those walls through the servers. And if you have 30 people on laptops in the same room, there's not enough capacity. So more spectrum, better spectrum, is going to make all these things more possible.
Senator, multi-channel news. I haven't heard any numbers associated with the value of the white space in terms of what it would add to the U.S. economy on an unlicensed basis and what it might bring to the federal U.S. Treasury through an auction. Are there any numbers to toss around?
Well, you should ask Chuck. Chuck's actually done some calculations on the license side, estimates of what an auction might bring. As I said in my talk, it's very hard to figure out what the consumer surplus is actually for any of these bands. We're all talking about the future, and we don't know what the applications are going to be. Let me just refer to the findings that the British regulator came up with. What they said was that for Wi-Fi-like applications, the value is of the order of $10 to $15 per megahertz pop. So I've taken the number that they got for Britain and converted it to dollars and divided by the British population to get a megahertz per head population. So the numbers that they got for cellular were $10 to $40 per megahertz per head of population. That's a net present value of 20 years future revenues. There have been other numbers thrown around. The thing that I find disconcerting is that the numbers are all over the shop. So, for example, Professor Hazer at the GMU estimated that if the value of all the auction spectrum is about $1.50 per megahertz population per year. I did a back of the envelope calculation for Wi-Fi, and I came up with a number slightly smaller, but in the same ballpark. So, your guess is as good as anybody else's, including the economists.
Well, I need to write a sentence that says something like, white spaces proponents believe that this spectrum on a licensed basis has this kind of value. Can you put an aggregate figure that's per megahertz per pop, is there anything?
If you're asking me, I think
Yes.
any of those numbers are fiction. That's all rubbish. It's meaningless.
I think the answer is 10 gazillion.
There's no way you can quantify it?
How do you quantify the future? Look, companies miss their numbers, their quarterly forecasts every week. And you're asking us to make a 20-year forecast.
Yeah. One just a quick thing is a part of the problem, which it bears emphasizing. Pierre mentioned when he spoke, was that and I think I alluded to it in a sense by saying, well, there's no middleman, is you don't have, with unlicensed, the consumer can get off-the-shelf equipment, which because it's mass-produced is cheaper, so there's consumer surplus there, just by the fact that you can do that, like the routers you buy, from Cisco, say at Best Buy, and then you just operate. You don't have to buy a subscription. Okay, so that's a non-monetized benefit to the consumer. All of that, consumer surplus, and there's not a middleman to ring the cash register so that Hazel or somebody else can say, it's look at what it's contributing to GDP. Cell phone companies charge you $50 billion, so it must be worth $50 billion. You wouldn't be paying for it. Well, the fact is, the good news is you don't have to pay for it. There's no middleman. You buy the device, which is a lot cheaper, and you just use it on the free public airways. So that's why it's a great value, but there is no, I agree, no economic study that I know of.
If you want to punch, this is not punchy enough for a punchline. My reading of the stuff that I've seen is the value numbers for licensed and unlicensed, where you're looking at comparable kinds of bands, are roughly the same, within a factor of 2 or 4. They're roughly the same. So whatever one camp will say, the other camp can claim the same.
Other questions? Yeah.
Issues identified as Adam Riley from satellite radio. This issue would be closely tied to consumers' enjoyment of Wi-Fi music now at school, but Wi-Fi seems to be something that people really feel as part of their lifeblood now. Is there any way to find out where the path on the road running out of bandwidth and servers for other applications? But that would seem to me to resonate with consumers to really get to the mind of this. Something you can't envision.
I'll take a different perspective in the sense of how we're kind of looking at the future. Right now, I think there's a spectrum grant candidate. And we're going to have one big auction, and that's it. After that, and then there's and then I think what's going to happen is people's expectations of bandwidth and capacity that they're getting on their fixed lines, just like. Remember how we saw the cell phone system go into to mobile. Those expectations, for what I get in a fixed lines context, I want in a mobile context. So obviously that, or portable, the sense of, walking around the school or Starbucks, whatever the case may be. So I think that capacity constraints are going to drive the demand for unlicensed or over-the-air mobile broadband, licensed or unlicensed, could be. So to the extent you see the landline speeds going up, I would say expect that the mobile ones would soon follow. Maybe not exactly in lockstep, and maybe not as fast. But I mean, that's kind of what's happening now. I see it. So, and that's where we see then, okay, if there's no auctions left, everything's out there, and how hard, we already did some difficult rebanding or repurposing of bands. Even took some from military and auctioned it. How are we going to transition from legacy old systems to new ones in the future? And like they did in the UK, I think the UK is a good example to follow actually of how they've developed their spectrum policy, is through a rights, flexible rights granted to spectrum owners, and then hopefully market makers to aggregate those pieces of spectrum and then provide it, for whatever Wi-Fi services are demanded. I mean, it's just like XM, that spoiled me.
And I'd just like to pick up on that. I think you make a very good point about the enthusiasm that people have for Wi-Fi. I feel that the kinds of enthusiasm that people have for Wi-Fi will be duplicated in the white space. If, in my thought experiment, we never had Wi-Fi, and that spectrum was auctioned, we would have got no cellular service in that band, right? We would not have had anything like this explosion of toys and weird things and these sort of things. As Michael said, having a portfolio approach, have a diversified portfolio of different bands, and in each of those different bands have different regulatory options, licensed and auction, unlicensed and auction. In each of them, I believe will generate a whole lot of exciting things that people get passionate about in the white spaces too, if you allow unlicensed solutions to flourish.
Okay. One last question.
What impact do
Yeah,
you...
identify yourself.
Oh, sure. Lenore Shafman, Keystone Tucker, business strategist. What impact do you see this having with the combination of grid computing and the ability to push heavy data through these networks and possibly through the white space? I mean, how do you see these technologies coming together in terms of delivery?
I'll have a shot at that.
That sounds right.
I'll start at the exact opposite end of the spectrum of grid computing, which is that if you try and think 10 years into the future, which I've just said you can't do, probably what we're going to find is that sensors and actuators, little chips like RFID chips stuck on products you buy on pallets, are going to dwarf by an order of magnitude all the other computation that's out there. So pretty much every object is going to have processing power in it and is going to want to talk to everybody else. So the question is, how do you connect this huge amount of stuff on the edge to these big grid computers in the center? And in a way, it's like, bacteria. I think it's something like 10% of your body weight, in fact, of the bacteria that live inside it. So there's a huge number of these things. We need a wide range of different choices, how fast this thing goes, how far it goes, to connect the edge to the center. And the white space is just one small part of the mix. So the example, I think that, I forget who gave it, about the sensors in the vineyards. How do you get the data from all those thousands of sensors out in the vineyards from the vineyards to the farmhouse? It's not going to go all the way from the sensor to the farmhouse because you need a lot of power, and you're not going to put a lot of battery power in the sensor. So you'll aggregate. You'll have one in every vineyard, and then you want to be able to go a couple of miles to the farmhouse. Actually, in Iowa, you might be able to go straight shot with Wi-Fi. In the Napa Valley, you won't because it's more undulated. And so the way in which those sensors will connect to the grid will probably be through better range technologies like white space.
Good. Let me just add, make one sort of closing comment. I think in a lot of ways this issue is really one about how much do we want to embrace the future and innovation. I mean, the sort of safest thing we can do is just say, well, we'll leave it the way it is, and nobody's going to complain, nobody's TV is going to get hurt, which is not clear that'll happen anyway. But I think this is really more about saying, look, there's this amazing possibilities that Pierre talks about, and we really can't even imagine what these possibilities are going to be. And so we have sort of a known possible risk with an unknown possible large amounts of benefits. And I think hopefully our politics will be able to get us to the right answer, which is to embrace the innovation and the risk and the potential. So with that, I want to please join me in thanking 4 excellent panelists.